I didn't pack a suitcase. I packed evidence. 3 banker's boxes, 2 external hard drives, and a folder I'd been quietly building for 2 years. The night I loaded them into my car, the temperature in Calgary had dropped to -23. I didn't feel it. I'd been cold for much longer than that. Let me start from where it actually began. Not the day I left, but the day I understood what I was to my family. I was 12 years old. I had just won second place in the provincial science fair, a project on water filtration I had spent 4 months building in our garage. I carried the ribbon home in my backpack because I wanted to surprise my parents at dinner. I set it on the kitchen table next to my father's plate. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Your brother placed first at regionals last spring," he said. Then he picked up his fork and kept eating. I took the ribbon back upstairs. I put it in a drawer I kept locked. That was the pattern for the next decade. My brother was 3 years older than me, and in our house, he was simply better. Better at school, better at sports, better at being seen. My mother introduced him at family gatherings with a list of accomplishments, the way other parents read off a resume. When she introduced me, she usually said something like, "And this is my daughter," with the kind of pause that made the word also feel implied. My brother went to the University of Toronto on partial scholarship, studying finance. My parents paid the rest without blinking. One daughter is a doctor, into the environmental engineering program at the University of Calgary, a program with a 68% acceptance rate that I had worked 2 part-time jobs to qualify for. My father said, "That's a long way from home for a girl program." I was 17 when he said that. I smiled because I had already learned that nothing else worked. I paid for my own degree. Student loans, a part-time job at a civil engineering firm doing data entry, a summer position with the City Water Authority that turned into a contract by my second year. By the time I graduated, I had managed to keep my debt under $22,000, which, for a 4-year engineering degree in Canada, is something I am genuinely proud of. I had a spreadsheet. I tracked every dollar coming in and every dollar going out. Every coffee, every textbook, every grocery run. I knew exactly where I stood at all times because I could not afford not to. My parents did not come to my convocation. My mother said it was too far. It was a 2-hour flight from Toronto. My brother sent a text that said congrats with a thumbs up emoji. I saved it. Not out of sentimentality. I just kept records of things by then. I accepted a full-time position with a water management consulting firm in Calgary 6 weeks after graduation. Within 18 months, I had paid off $14,000 of my loans. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in Beltline, close to the train, walking distance to the river pathway. I built a life that was quiet and organized and entirely mine. I did not ask my family for anything. I stopped waiting for them to ask how I was doing. I checked in at Christmas and on birthdays because I still believed, somewhere underneath everything, that the door should stay open even if I was the only one standing near it. That lasted until I was 27. My brother called on a Tuesday evening in March. He almost never called, texted occasionally, usually forwarded articles about engineering being automated, which I think was his version of humor. When his name appeared on my screen, I felt a small, strange drop in my stomach. I answered. "Hey," he said. "Mom and Dad need to talk to you." I asked what was going on. "Just, they need to talk to you. Can you call them tonight?" He hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat with my phone for a few minutes. Then I called my parents' landline, which they still had, because my father refused to be what he called dependent on a device. My mother answered on the second ring. Her voice was different, softer, which on her was not a comfort, but a warning. She said my father had been dealing with some financial difficulties. She said the word difficulties, the way doctors say uncomfortable. meaning it is worse than that. She said they had some debt that had gotten away from them, and that they needed help, and that they were asking me because I had always been so responsible with money. I asked how much. She said $38,000. I was quiet for long enough that she said my name twice. I asked what the money was for. She said investments that hadn't performed the way they expected. She said my father had trusted someone he shouldn't have. She said these things happen. She said your brother is still getting established and can't help right now. And we didn't know who else to ask. I told her I needed some time to think about it. She said, of course, we wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate. I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor for a while. The next morning I called my brother. He told me the investment story again, almost word for word, which told me they had coordinated. I asked him directly whether he knew more than he was saying. He paused just a beat too long before he said no. I noted that. I asked him why he couldn't contribute anything, and he said he had his own expenses, a new lease on a condo downtown, some credit card consolidation. He said it with the ease of someone who has never had to justify a purchase in his life. I did not agree to anything. I told him I would think about it. I started making calls. I have a colleague. She is a few years older than me, works in environmental compliance, and has the best instincts for spotting problems of anyone I know. Over coffee, I told her what my parents had said and she listened without interrupting, which is rare for her. When I finished, she said, "Do you actually believe the investment story?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Find out before you do anything." I had already started. I called my parents back that weekend and asked some specific questions. The name of the investment firm, whether they had filed a complaint with the IROC, whether they had spoken to a lawyer. My mother got flustered. My father took the phone and said I was making things complicated. He said I was treating family like a transaction. I wrote down exactly what he said. Over the following 3 weeks, I did what I always do with problems. I built a picture. I talked to my aunt, my father's sister, who lives in Mississauga and has never fully trusted my mother. She told me something she had been sitting on for a while. She said my father had been going to Niagara Falls every few weeks for the past 2 years. She said she didn't want to assume anything, but she had her suspicions. She said my mother knew and was covering for him. I called a credit counselor I found through my employee assistance program. I described the situation without giving names. She said the pattern I was describing, vague, investment losses, reluctance to name specific institutions, one sibling being asked while the other was protected, urgency without documentation was consistent with problem gambling debt. She walked me through what questions to ask. I called my parents again. I asked my father to send me any documentation he had, statements, receipts, correspondence with any financial institution. I said I couldn't help without understanding the situation fully. He said he didn't have everything organized right now. I said, "Take your time." He sent nothing. 2 weeks later, my mother called me crying. She said my father was in a very dark place and she was scared, and she needed me to just help them, please, without all these questions, because the questions were making things worse. She said, "You have always made things harder than they need to be. Why can't you just be a daughter?" I wrote that down too. I called my aunt back. She had been doing her own quiet checking. She told me she had spoken to a cousin who works in the casino industry, not in any official capacity, just someone who understood the patterns. She said it looked like my father had been running up losses at the tables and at online betting for somewhere between 18 months and 2 years. She said the 38,000 was probably not the full number. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be careful here about something. When I found out, I did not feel victorious. I felt something closer to grief, that had already been waiting a long time to be named. This was not a surprise, the way you are surprised by something you could not have anticipated. This was a surprise the way you feel when a thing you always suspected is finally confirmed, and you realize part of you knew and spent years being kind anyway. I had not sent any money. That was the thing I kept coming back to. I had asked questions instead of opening my account. I had slowed it down long enough to see the shape of it. I called my brother. This time I told him what I had found out. Not as an accusation. I genuinely did not know how much he knew. I laid it out plainly. The timeline, the Niagara Falls trips, the missing documentation, what my aunt had told me, what the credit counselor had confirmed as a pattern. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I knew something was wrong with the story. I just didn't want to be the one to say it." I asked him why he had called me first, that Tuesday in March. He said, "Because they told me to. They said you'd help without asking too many questions because you still wanted them to." He stopped. I waited. He said, "They said you'd want to prove yourself." There it was. $38,000, and the pitch was built on the fact that I still, at 27 years old, wanted my parents to see me as enough. They had calculated that. They had used it. I think that was the moment I actually let go of something I had been carrying since I was 12 years old, with a ribbon in my backpack. My brother and I talked for almost 2 hours that night. It was the longest real conversation we had ever had. He told me things I hadn't known. That he had felt pressure his entire life to perform for them. That the praise came with conditions he had not always understood, until he was already failing them. That he had loaned them money twice before and they had never paid it back. He told me he had not come to my convocation because my parents told him it would be a short, low-key ceremony and not worth the trip. He had believed them. I told him I had the ribbon still. The one from the science fair. He didn't know what I was talking about until I explained it, and then he was very quiet again. We decided to handle this together. We are both adults. We are both their children. We were not going to pretend we didn't know what we knew, and we were not going to disappear without saying it out loud. We set up a video call with our parents 2 weeks later. We did not tell them it would be both of us. When my mother saw my brother on the screen beside me, she went very still. My brother spoke first. He said he knew about the gambling. He said he knew the investment story was not true. He said he was not angry, and I believed him. He had processed this longer than I had. But he needed them to understand that what they had asked me to do, using the frame they had used, was something he could not stand behind. My father said we were ganging up on him. I said, calmly, that I had given him 3 weeks to produce documentation and he had produced none. I said I wanted to be clear that I was not going to contribute to covering a gambling debt and that I needed them to understand that I knew exactly what had been asked of me and why. My mother started to cry. I had spent a long time being moved by my mother crying. I was not moved this time. That is not cruelty. That is just what happens when you finally understand the architecture of a thing. My father said we had no idea how much pressure he had been under, how hard he had worked for this family, how ungrateful we were being. My brother said, very evenly, "Dad, I've loaned you money twice. I never asked for it back, but I'm not in a position to watch you go after my sister with a story you both knew wasn't true." My father hung up. My mother stayed on the call for another minute. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her look. She said, "I hope you're both happy." Then she left too. My brother and I stayed on the call together. We didn't say much. At some point he said, "Penn State would have been glad to have you for whatever that's worth." It took me a second to realize he meant it generally, that he had been thinking about all the ways they had minimized what I'd done. I told him the University of Calgary had a top 15 environmental engineering program in North America, and that I had never once regretted going there. He said, "I know." I looked it up. That was something. In the months after that call, I kept my distance from my parents, not dramatically, not with a letter or an announcement. I just stopped filling the space. I stopped being the one who reached out. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. and had tried to make a financial instrument out of it. My brother and I talk regularly now. He has started therapy, which he told me about in a way that suggested he expected me to be surprised. I wasn't. I told him I had been in therapy for 3 years. He said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I said there was never really a good time. We are figuring out what a real relationship looks like between two people who grew up in the same house but were raised, in some important ways, in entirely different families. It is slower than I expected and more worthwhile. My father did eventually get into a problem gambling support program. My aunt told me, not my parents. I do not know the details and I did not ask. I hope it helps him. I mean that. But hope from a distance is still distance, and after everything I have described, I think you can understand why I need that space. My debt is fully paid off now. I have an emergency fund with 6 months of expenses sitting in a TFSA. I have a small RRSP I started at 24 because I read an article and decided future me deserved something. I track everything. Not from anxiety anymore, not from the feeling that the ground could give way at any moment. I do it now because I like the clarity. Because knowing exactly where you stand is not the same thing as being cold. It is the opposite, actually. It is the warmest thing I ever learned to do for myself. I still have the ribbon. It lives on my bookshelf now, not in a locked drawer. Second place, Provincial Science Fair, Water Filtration Systems, 2008. I look at it sometimes when I need to remember that I was always doing the work. The right people just weren't watching. They are watching now. I used to think that being overlooked was something that happened to you. Something other people did and you either survived it or you didn't. It took me a long time to understand that how you respond to being overlooked is actually the whole story. That is what I carried away from everything I've described tonight. When my parents looked at me and saw the lesser child, they were not seeing me clearly. They were seeing a role they had already decided I would play, and for years, I tried to step out of that role quietly, without confrontation, without making it anyone's problem but my own. I paid my own way. I tracked every dollar. I built something real in a city I chose for myself, surrounded by work that mattered. That was not stubbornness. That was integrity operating before I had a name for it. Every spreadsheet I kept, every loan payment I made ahead of schedule, every question I asked instead of just opening my account. Those were not small things. Those were the moments where my character was actually being formed, even when no one was watching. What my parents did was a choice that came from a place of desperation, yes, but also from a habit of underestimating me, that they had been building since I was 12 years old. They believed I still needed their approval badly enough to skip the questions. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong is because I had spent 15 years becoming someone who does not skip the questions. That is what integrity looks like in practice. Not a grand gesture, just the slow, unglamorous work of knowing what you stand for before anyone asks you to compromise it. My brother surprised me. I think he surprised himself. He had been living inside a different kind of pressure. The pressure of being the one who was supposed to be enough for both of us. And he had carried that quietly too. When he finally said out loud what he knew, something shifted between us that I don't think either of us expected. That is what honesty does when it arrives late. It does not undo the years. But it builds something forward that could not have been built any other way. I think about the ribbon sometimes. Second place. Water filtration. A 12-year-old girl who spent 4 months on a project because she genuinely wanted to understand how clean water worked. That child deserved to have her work seen. She didn't get that, but she kept going anyway, and that persistence, not the praise, not the approval, but the persistence itself, is what carried her to a degree, a career, a life that is entirely hers. One daughter is a doctor. One daughter is a doctor. Sustain. Is that your effort has a cumulative weight that other people's opinions cannot cancel out. Every time you do the right thing when it would be easier not to. Every time you ask the hard question instead of accepting a comfortable lie. Every time you show up for yourself when no one else does. That compounds. It does not always compound visibly, but it compounds. And eventually, the person you have quietly been building turns out to be exactly who you needed when it mattered most. I kept the records. I asked the questions. I built the picture. That is the whole story.